Ah, listen closely for a moment. Have you ever noticed how certain souls, quietly, perceptive, tender, in ways they never asked to be, seem to begin their lives in the strangest, most unlikely places, as if the universe plants them like wild flowers in the cracks of forgotten pavement, just to see whether beauty can bloom where no one thought to look, or like small flames learning to dance in a wind that has never once considered their survival. Yet somehow they learn the rhythm anyway. And maybe, if you're honest, you've always felt a bit like that. Maybe when you look back on your childhood, it comes to you not as a single picture, but as a collage of soft ache and quiet bewilderment. Moments that didn't quite make sense then, and only half make sense now. Sometimes the first teachers life gives us aren't gentle rains, but storms, loud, impatient, unpredictable, the kind that leave you shivering, wondering what lesson you were supposed to learn from all that. Thunder. But hear this, you're not alone in that wondering, and you are certainly, unquestionably, not broken. If anything, you might simply be one of those rare beings the world tried to test a little early just to see if you'd notice your own strength before the rest of the world saw it in you. Some of the wisest hearts I've known began in households where love was confused, tangled, or entirely misplaced. Homes where affection came with conditions, where warmth flickered on and off like an unreliable lantern, where apologies were scarce and misunderstandings grew like vines up every wall. Yet somehow, in that confusion, something rare awakened a kind of inner listening, a heightened sense of the invisible, a sensitivity that would not have stirred in gentler soil. It's a strange alchemy, isn't it? How the very environment that should have softened you instead forged you, not into something hardened, but into someone deep. So sit with me a while as we wander through this curious paradox. Why the universe often plants its most sensitive seeds in the hardest ground, and why the cracks in your early life may have been the doorway to your awakening. You know, I've spent many years, more than I care to count, watching the way human beings unfold, and there's a pattern I keep noticing, like a secret thread woven through so many quiet stories. Those who carry the deepest understanding often began their journey in the most turbulent waters, not because pain is noble, no, let's not romanticize that, and not because suffering makes anyone better, but because difficulty has a way of stripping you down to what's essential, revealing things you would never have discovered in calm seas. Think of it this way. When you are born into a family where something feels fundamentally wrong, where the emotional air itself is thick with confusion or cruelty, or a silence that speaks louder than any argument, your inner compass begins to twitch. You don't have words for it yet, especially as a child. You just feel the shift, that subtle tightening in your chest, that small voice saying, something here isn't safe, isn't steady, isn't as it should be. And while the adults around you may have been blind to it, you weren't. You felt things before you understood them. You noticed fractures long before anyone admitted they were there. And in that noticing, the awakening quietly began. But somewhere deep in your bones, you know, this isn't right. This early knowing, uncomfortable as it is, unwelcome as it is, becomes the first whisper of awakening. It's as though your soul recognized dysfunction long before your mind had the language to name it. And that recognition, that uneasiness sitting in your chest like a stone in your shoe, it doesn't let you rest. It turns every small moment into a quiet question. It nudges you toward awareness you never asked for. And as we notice that uneasiness, this small, persistent stone, we start to feel something else stirring beneath it. Because real transformation, the kind that reshapes who you are from the inside out, rarely blooms in peaceful gardens where everything grows easy. I've watched this truth unfold again and again over the years. The deepest wisdom doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in the heat generated by conflict, confusion, and contradiction. It grows in the places where you weren't sheltered, where you weren't protected, where your innocence cracked too early and too suddenly. When your family environment is chaotic or cold or cruel, something happens to your perception. The suffering acts like a fire, burning away the comfortable illusions most people carry throughout their entire lives. People raised in gentler circumstances, and I say this without judgment, simply as observation, often drift through life accepting the surface of things. They don't question the nature of love, because love arrived to them without riddles or sharp edges. They don't examine the masks people wear because the faces they grew up with appeared honest enough. But you couldn't afford such innocence. Your family taught you accidentally, unwillingly, that people often say one thing and mean another. That affection can arrive wrapped in control, that love may come tangled with guilt or silence or demands to shrink yourself just to keep the peace, that the world is not always as it appears. And while this knowledge came at a cost, it also gave you something rare, something precious, the ability to see what is real beneath what is performed. When the fire burns away what is not ours, we begin to glimpse the tiny grain of sand at the center of our irritation, the source of the ache we spent years trying to ignore. Let me tell you about oysters. When a grain of sand or any small irritant slips inside the oyster's soft body, it cannot be expelled. The oyster can't simply reject what hurts. It must learn to live with the intrusion. So nature, in its peculiar wisdom, chooses another path. Layer by slow, patient layer, the oyster coats the irritant in nacre mother of pearl, softening it, shaping it, transforming it. And over time, something luminous takes form. The most beautiful thing the oyster creates arises directly from what wounded it. Your difficult family, with all their fractures, all their contradictions, all their unmet needs and unspoken fears, they were that grain of sand. Intrusive, unwelcome, impossible to remove. And you, through every year, spent trying to make sense of the chaos, through every quiet act of endurance, through every night wondering what was wrong with them, or more cruelly, what was wrong with you. You were coating that grain with layer after layer of insight, perception, imagination, resilience. What formed was depth. Not perfection, never perfection, but a kind of inner knowing forged through quiet survival, a perceptiveness shaped in the shadows, an ability to read between the lines, to sense what people aren't saying, to feel emotional currents hidden beneath the calmest social surfaces. These are not skills acquired in peaceful homes. These are the gifts of those who were forced to develop eyes that see in the dark. Yet pearls are not the only gifts formed in the dark. Another arises when we realize love itself has been distorted. Here's where things get interesting and perhaps uncomfortable. When you grow up in a dysfunctional family, your entire understanding of love becomes confused from the very beginning. Love mixed with fear. Love mixed with control. Love mixed with silence that feels like punishment. Love that arrives unpredictably, like rain in a desert, sparse and conditional. For most people, this confusion would simply become their template. They grow up and repeat the same patterns without ever questioning them. But something in you, that sensitive soul we spoke of earlier, couldn't accept the distortion. Somewhere deep inside, a voice began to whisper, "No, this isn't what love is supposed to be." That whisper was your first rebellion. And here's the profound thing. That questioning forced you into a journey most people never have to take. You couldn't simply accept what you were taught about love. The pattern was too obviously broken. So you had to go deeper beneath the conditioning, beneath the family mythology, to discover for yourself what love actually means when it's not tangled up with manipulation, guilt, or conditions. This inquiry, this refusal to accept the distorted map you were given, became the doorway to genuine awakening. And once that question appears, it spreads like a ripple across a still lake, leading us deeper into the currents beneath the surface. Because once you start questioning what love is, you inevitably start questioning who taught you. And this is where another veil begins to lift. For years, maybe decades, you saw your family members as towering figures, parents as gods, or monsters, or some confusing combination of both. But awakening brings a different kind of sight. Gradually, sometimes suddenly, you begin to see them not as mythic figures, but as fragile humans, shaped by their own wounds. Your mother, who could never show warmth, was perhaps never shown warmth herself. Your father, whose anger filled the house like smoke, was likely raised in a house filled with the same choking atmosphere. This seeing doesn't excuse what they did. Understanding is not the same as condoning, but it does something crucial. It dissolves the old fantasies you might have been carrying. The fantasy that one day they'll change, wake up, become who you needed them to be all along. The fantasy that if you just find the right words, the perfect explanation, they'll finally understand what they did. The fantasy that you can somehow heal them, fix them, love them enough that they'll transform. These fantasies, beautiful and heartbreaking as they are, keep us chained to the past. When they dissolve, when we finally see our family members as wounded people acting from their wounds, incapable of giving what they never received, something extraordinary happens. Recognition brings grief, yes, the grief of accepting what will never be, but it also brings freedom. Freedom, of course, has roots, and those roots often grow in unexpected directions. You see, there's an old observation about trees that grow on mountainsides, exposed to constant wind. Engineers have studied these trees and found something remarkable. The trees that grow in sheltered valleys, protected from harsh weather, develop relatively shallow root systems. They don't need to dig deep because nothing threatens to knock them over. But the trees on the mountainside, bent and shaped by relentless wind, develop roots that go extraordinarily deep. They have to, or they'd be torn from the earth entirely. Your difficult family was that relentless wind, pushing, bending, challenging your very ability to stand upright. And whether you realized it or not, you were developing roots that went very, very deep. Strength doesn't come from protection. This is what the mountain trees teach us. It comes from learning to find balance in the storm, from developing inner stability when outer circumstances provide none. You learn discernment, how to read people, how to sense danger, how to protect yourself. You learned emotional resilience, how to bend without breaking, how to recover from wounds, how to keep your heart from closing entirely despite every reason to shut down. You learned self-reliance, that you couldn't depend on your family for emotional safety, so you had to find it within yourself. These roots, formed in difficult soil, go deeper than most people's roots ever need to go. And with deep roots, another vision becomes possible, the vision of those who live untouched by such winds. Let me speak plainly about something I've observed over many years. There's a fundamental difference between those who've lived on life's surface and those who've been forced to dive beneath it. People raised in ease, in harmony, in families where love flowed freely and predictably, they often move through the world with a certain lightness. And there's beauty in that, truly. But there's also, if I may say it gently, a kind of blindness that comes from never having to look too closely at the darkness. They believe what people tell them, because deception was never a survival skill they needed to detect. They trust the surface because the surface, in their experience, has always been reliable. But you learned early that surfaces lie. You learned that a smile can mask contempt, that I love you can mean I own you, that family gatherings can be performances, hiding private suffering. This knowing, painful as it was to acquire, gave you the ability to see behind the curtain that divides appearance from reality. You see the shadows others miss. You hear what's not being said. You understand the contradictions that others simply accept without question. Visual cue, optical illusion, revealing two different images depending on how you look. This is what I mean by depth. It's not a matter of intelligence or education. I've known highly educated people who lived entirely on the surface, and others with no formal schooling whose understanding ran fathoms deep. Depth is the capacity to see into the heart of things, to recognize patterns, to understand that what we call reality is often just agreed upon pretense. This seeing is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of what we might call spiritual adulthood. And it grows, almost always, from having been forced to question what others take for granted. And when we see clearly, we begin to understand the long river behind us, because here's something that might shift your entire understanding of your family's toxicity. Your family didn't invent their dysfunction. They inherited it, just as you might have inherited it, had you not chosen differently. Imagine a river flowing from high mountains, carrying sediment, pollutants, debris from far upstream. Your great-grandparents perhaps lived through war, poverty, trauma that had no name and no treatment. They survived as best they could. But survival often means shutting down, hardening, passing on fear disguised as protection. They raised your grandparents with that hardness, that fear, that inability to speak of feelings or show softness. Your grandparents, knowing no other way, raised your parents with similar patterns, perhaps slightly different in expression, but same in essence. Criticism disguised as love, control disguised as care, silence disguised as strength. And your parents, wounded in ways they likely never examined, raised you with those same patterns, the only patterns they knew. Each generation hands forward its unhealed pain, because healing requires something most people never learn: the courage to stop, to look, to question, to feel what they've been running from. But you became the one who finally said, "This ends with me." Whether you spoke it aloud or simply lived it in your choices, you became the circuit breaker in a generational pattern of pain. And that makes you not a victim of your family's dysfunction, but its transformer. You are the one who metabolized generations of unprocessed suffering. And in saying no to the old river, we quietly begin carving a new one. There's an irony here that's worth sitting with. Your family members, as harmful as their behavior may have been, taught you through the most powerful method there is: negative example. A good teacher shows you the path, but a negative teacher, one who shows you exactly what happens when people remain unconscious, can be even more instructive. Your mother's coldness taught you the cost of emotional shutdown. Your father's rage taught you what happens when pain is never processed, only expressed. Your family's manipulation taught you to value honesty with an intensity others might never develop. Their control taught you to value freedom. Their conditions taught you to value acceptance. Everything they did wrong became a map of what you would not do. And here's the gift hidden in that terrible teaching. It forced you to choose, consciously and deliberately, who you would become. Most people never have to make that choice. They simply become a slightly modified version of their parents. Same patterns, different details, but you had to forge your identity through conscious decision. I will not be cold like my mother. I will not rage like my father. I will not manipulate those I claim to love. Every choice became an act of creation, and in that constant, difficult work of choosing who you would be, rather than accepting who you were programmed to become, something remarkable happened. You became awake, conscious, present. Yourself not an echo of generations past, but an original voice. And with choice comes an unusual kind of clarity, one that reshapes even our understanding of compassion. Now we arrive at something subtle, something that often confuses people when they're working to make peace with difficult families. There's a difference, a crucial difference, between understanding someone and allowing them to continue harming you. You can understand that your mother's inability to show affection came from never having been shown affection herself. You can have genuine compassion for the frightened child she once was, the wounds she carried, the limited tools she had for being human. And at the same time, you can choose not to have a relationship with her. These are not contradictory positions. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion, it's self-abandonment. Understanding why someone harms others doesn't obligate you to remain in range of that harm. This is what mature love looks like. It can hold two truths simultaneously. I see your pain, and I will protect myself from your behavior. Boundaries are not cruelty. Distance can be an act of deep self-respect. You can wish someone well while wishing them well from far away. You can hold space for their humanity without making space for them in your daily life. This understanding that love doesn't require sacrifice of self, that compassion includes compassion for yourself. This is wisdom that people from healthy families often struggle to grasp. They feel guilty setting boundaries because love, in their experience, never required them. But you learned early that boundaries are how we love without losing ourselves. And in that gentle stepping back, something else emerges, an inner light discovered when the outer world felt too dark. Here's perhaps the most redemptive aspect of having been born into a chaotic family. When the external world is unsafe, when your home is filled with unpredictability, anger, coldness, or confusion, you learn to build a refuge elsewhere. And the only place left, the only place that can't be invaded by your family's dysfunction, is within. So you turned inward, perhaps into books that showed you other ways of being, perhaps into imagination that created the love and safety your actual world lacked, perhaps into observation, watching, learning, understanding human nature because survival depended on reading the room accurately, perhaps into art, music, nature, any realm where truth felt more reliable than in your family's house of mirrors. This inward turn, born of necessity, became your salvation, because in going inward, beneath the noise and chaos, you discovered something extraordinary, your true self. Not the self your family wanted you to be, compliant, quiet, whatever role they assigned. You in their drama. Not the self society expected, whatever masks you learned to wear to navigate the world. But the self you actually are, beneath all conditioning, beneath all wounds, beneath all the stories about who you should be. This self is uncorrupted. This self knows what it knows. This self recognizes truth and recoils from falseness. And in healing this self, in giving it the love and acceptance your family could not provide, you do something profound. You heal not just yourself, but the lineage. Every time you choose differently than your parents chose, you transform the inherited darkness into light. Every time you offer yourself the compassion you never received, you change the family story. You become what your ancestors needed but never had. And that light you cultivated in your inner world, that becomes a lantern for others walking similar paths. And so, like all journeys of depth, we arrive not at an ending, but a quiet opening. If you trace the threads of your life gently with your fingertips, you may notice something remarkable. What hurt you also shaped you. What confused you also awakened you. And what you survived has become the quiet wisdom you now carry like a lamp cupped carefully in tired but steady hands. You were not born into difficulty to be broken. You were born there so you could see clearly enough to choose another way. And in choosing, you have become the turning point in a story much older than you. Your children, if you have them, will not inherit what you inherited. The pattern stops with you. Not because you're perfect, you're not. And that's not the point. But because you're conscious. Because you questioned. Because you chose. And that consciousness, that questioning, that choosing, this is what awakening looks like. It's not about being enlightened in some abstract sense, floating above human concerns in perpetual bliss. It's about being awake to the patterns, seeing them, understanding them, and responding with awareness rather than repeating them unconsciously. It's about knowing that you carry wounds and choosing not to wound others with them. It's about recognizing that your family did the best they could with what they had, and knowing that your best includes what they never learned. Let this understanding settle softly inside you, like dusk light on an old wooden floor. You are not damaged goods. You are not broken. You are awake beautifully, painfully, courageously awake. And the world needs that awakeness more than it needs another person sleepwalking through life, repeating patterns they never examined. So when the old pain rises, and it will, because healing is not linear, remember this. Your difficult beginning was not a mistake. It was the fire that forged you, the grain that became your pearl, the darkness that taught you to cultivate inner light. And you have done something extraordinary with it. You have become the turning point, the cycle breaker, the ancestor your descendants will speak of with gratitude if they ever come to know the story. And if this reflection stirred a gentle recognition in you, perhaps consider sharing that feeling in whatever small way feels right. A quiet note, a simple click, or by returning here when the heart gets heavy again. Your presence here shapes this little circle of reflection more than you know. We are all walking each other home, and sometimes the ones who've walked the darkest paths know the way most clearly. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Until we meet again in this space of gentle questioning and deeper seeing,